Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin this editorial, I'd just like, in the centennial year of remembrance, to propose a moment's silence for the passing of those brave, noble, respectable people that shall never grow old, the railway grapevine. You think I can get you laugh? Yeah, it's a long story how they managed to get themselves deleted off social media, but given their record of targeted harassment, I don't think anybody's going to miss them. Moving swiftly on. I've deliberately avoided doing anything to commemorate the end of standard gauge steam on BR in August 1968. Not least because my workload is already strenuous enough, my personal life has fewer fingers than a brakeman's hand, and the world beyond trains has more problems than solutions, so marking a downer might be seen as adding to the pile of downers, even though I said in a previous editorial that it was just the beginning of a happier time, but because the passing of the quote-unquote glory days of steam has already been commemorated in the best possible way. By BBC Bristol 30 years ago. The Train Now Departing was a 6-part TV show reflecting rail travel and particularly steam traction in the UK 20 years after the 15 Guineas special. It took numerous aspects of railway life at the time and examined their relation to the old days of steam, such as railways under threat, mainline steam revivals, the industrial sector, a then and now look at the South Western Main Line, an obscure offshore independent network, and the efforts of heritage railways and locomotive groups at the time. Many of these themes overlapped from episode to episode, but the running narrative remained consistent. 20 years after the end of steam, it remains a strong part of our lives. Just not in the way that we think that it does. The show was written and narrated by the late documentary presenter Anthony Smith, who provides a very gentle, eloquent link between the frequent monologues and testimonies provided by various railway workers, enthusiasts, and historians interviewed in each episode. Everybody who speaks on this show addresses the audience like a gentle storyteller addressing their grandchildren about their life. It adds a very homely and somewhat personal connection between contributors and audience. You feel sorry for some of those people whose lives were affected by the beaching cuts or the change from steam to diesel because of their personal recollections. It's a style that you tend not to see as much of nowadays. The editing and cinematography is beyond superb. That's Nick Lira doing most of the filming, which is complemented with archive material from Ivo Peters, and it's a perfect blend of old and new. Every mechanical camera movement is smooth, the shots are all cut at just the right time, the framing is good, the colours are nice, and while it was far from Ealing Technicolor landscape, the weather seems to have complemented the shots rather than intrude on them. In long landscape settings, the sunlight shines on all the parts of the picture that the audience is expected to look at, like viaducts and towns. Even the handheld point-of-view shots aren't as shaky as you'd think they would be. There's a timeless feel to the production values of this show, thanks in part to the choice of music. With other railway documentaries produced in the 80s, like Steam Days and Great Railway Journeys of the World, you can kind of tell they were made in the 80s by those synthesizers they used throughout. Here though, the choice of music is deliberately nostalgic, composed with real instruments, indicating that it was still made in the old days of television, but not specifically when in the old days of television. The show itself was broadcast in November and December 1988, when the world-famous Settle and Carlisle Railway was earmarked for closure by BR, which was the setting for the first episode, The Long Drag. It's highly doubtful that this programme alone overturned BR's closure notice, seeing as thousands of campaigners had been protesting for years before, but it seems fitting that 5 months after the show aired, the British government offered a reprieve for the line on April 11th, 1989. And ever since, the railway has continued to amaze tourists and enthusiasts. Now, a lot has happened in railway preservation since 1988. We've had Mission Impossible locomotives resurrected from the dead and are now finding a new lease of life. Flying Scotsman has travelled to the Southern Hemisphere. There's been breakthroughs in engineering technology, allowing repairs and restoration milestones once considered impossible. There are new build projects popping up galore. There's been a 90-mile-an-hour dash, a 100-mile-an-hour dash, and many of the railway personnel interviewed in this programme have passed away. Tony Beard, Callum McCraeld, Eric Tonks, Di Woodham, pivotal railway workers, preservationists and storytellers who are no longer with us. Rest peacefully, chaps. And that is the main reason why I feel we couldn't make a show like this today. There are many railway folk you can speak to today about how railways run or used to run, but the generations have shifted from those who remember the grouping, war and post-war years to those who remember the 1950s and 60s through the 70s and up to today. If today you tried interviewing drivers, firemen, fitters, signalmen and station staff about the age of steam before the Second World War, you may not necessarily find as many people who lived in that time to choose from. Hell, even those who are left aren't always willing to talk. However, it's interesting to see the similarities and differences in the attitudes of railway workers of old compared to the attitudes of today. This was produced 25 years after Beeching's report had been published, so the animosity amongst railwaymen whose lives had been altered by these changes was still fairly strong.
Dr. Beeching, to my mind, was just a butcher. A 5-year-old could have done what Dr. Beeching did, because he just looked at a profit and loss account and he said, well, this line's paying and this one's not, so we'll cut it away. I think it was criminal.
Nowadays, there are still people talking about what Beeching did, but the attitude has shifted towards pointing the finger at Ernest Marples rather than Dr. Beeching. Beeching was just the man who surveyed the network, correlated the figures and recommended the cuts. Marples was the man who invested in the road network that monopolised on the railway's demise. But it's also interesting how, even in 1980s British Rail days, some attitudes towards Britain's railways were not too different to what's commonly believed nowadays.
We always feel that more should be invested in the railways. We feel the government put too much money into roads and the railways always seem to come off worst. And when you see the money that's being invested in other European countries, we feel a bit jealous.
But before you assume it's just crammed full of railway Luddites who wished for the old days, there were a couple of praises for newer ways of doing things to provide a little light and shade. In the West Highlander, we got to see how trains were controlled between single-line sections by radio transmission instead of mechanical tokens. In The Long Drag, retired signalman George Horner remarked how his generation ought to let some of the younger lads have a go. The Holiday Line episode, where former loco spotter Barry Smith retraces the steps of his annual trip to the southwest of England, he did remark how he liked the contemporary transformation of Waterloo Station, which, spoiler alert, is more than can be said for the rest of his journey. It's a shame, but this kind of documentary series about the days of steam may never reach the same level of delight. There have been several noteworthy accounts made for BBC4 in recent years, which tell the story of the demise of steam on BR and the pioneering preservationists who rose to the challenge through that demise, but as a general celebration and realisation of Britain's railway history, the train now departing seems to have never been matched. Mostly because the message it was trying to put across about how we shouldn't disregard the old ideas because we may need them again at some point in the future somehow remains as relevant today as it did in the age of cuts, closures and scrappages. If there was one summary of such a message, it might be this one taken from the episode Lines of Industry.
The industrial railways were a good idea, but were a bit inflexible. Like the poem about trams, they were creatures that moved in predestined grooves, and they have yielded all along the line to other forms of transport. But perhaps, what with the Channel Tunnel and with our road system becoming more clogged seemingly every day, they will make some kind of comeback. Not everything from the past was such a bad idea.
Now, I realise that was referring very specifically towards freight-only operation, but when you look at the big picture of railways in the UK, look at what's been happening since the 90s. According to the Department for Transport, the number of passenger journeys made in 2010 and 2011 was around 60% higher than it was in 1990 and 91. Now, no doubt there's going to be someone who's going to question where the information comes from, but however you look at the figures, it seems that John Betjeman might have had a point when he said we were all going to be going by train again one day. 30 years on since initial broadcast, The Train Now Departing is regarded by some to be one of the best TV shows ever made about railways. It goes to prove that railway audiences don't deserve random maths lessons or endless puns. We deserve a story to tell and a non-patronising, somewhat poetic and philosophical way of telling it. Though it helps if you have tons of railway workers to provide inner monologues as a means of carrying the story through, a la Fred Dibner style. Criminally, there has never been a DVD or digital download release of this show. If you're lucky to catch the episodes on BBC iPlayer, that's about as close to an official release as you're going to get without looking it up on YouTube or sticking to old VHS tapes. If you can find them and have a machine to play them on, of course. Put simply, if you can find this show anywhere, by all means give it a chance, because while the setting has aged a little bit, it's surprising how well the message and the production have stood the test of time. I'm Chris, and I'm here to gauge the issue.